sacks which had American flags on them. And now, how the North Korean government spun that for propaganda purposes was probably to treat it like tribute that was given to the North Koreans, and because it was distributed, through the public distribution system, which was very controversial among the donor community, because it, even though it was marked in sacks that said the United States or Caritas or humanitarian agencies, it simultaneously went through the public distribution system, therefore was in a way associated with the government. But the short answer to your question is that they've been open to receiving the assistance. The battles have typically been fought over the monitoring arrangements, because humanitarian principles require that aid be not just given to the government in question, but to be targeted on recipient groups that are the most vulnerable. So we're not interested in giving food to the military, obviously. We're not interested in giving food that's going to be sold in the market. We're interested in giving food to groups that are most severely affected. And that involves a lot of very detailed, tough negotiations between the donors and the North Korean government about where monitors are going to go, how many, can they speak Korean, can they visit sites, how do you track a bag of grain from the port to the delivery, to where it's ultimately delivered. And those negotiations are not easy negotiations. And when the North Koreans are in serious distress, they make more concessions, but when they receive food, they're more inclined to go back on them or limit the ability to monitor. So I think what's going to happen shortly is and this is the debate, I'm going to post something on this in the next week, is we've been looking at these monitoring agreements of past food aid programs to see whether there's enough in place that really can guarantee a robust humanitarian program. Because the critics say that it's just going to be deferred.
Yeah, one funny instance was when North Korean delegation visited South Korea for what talk I forgot, intergovernmental talk during Norman government. One of the North Korean delegates made this kind of remark: South Koreans should provide food to us because of our military first politics. We are protected from American threat. So that could apply to North Korea, not to South Korea, but probably he just forgot. But maybe the propaganda in North Korea is the nuclear weapon protects the whole Korean peninsula against American imperialist threat. I don't know. Probably that's why he made that kind of mistake. But that produced a lot of outrage, so South Korean government had to stop. So they.
Yeah.
Back on reunification, I was just curious: is there any use, or is it very useful to look to the German situation? And if so, has the current South Korean government worked with the current German government to learn about how reunification went for them?
Yeah, I mean, the people sometimes draw the parallels, but remember that the East German government essentially collapsed as part of a much wider set of changes across the region that included the Soviets backing away from their promise to provide support and a fairly robust civil society within East Germany itself. You had churches, you had professional associations, and one little factoid I often cite when looking at these comparisons, I think it's as much as, I think about 60% of East Germans received West German television in East Germany. So they had a very wide sense of what was going on the other side and were fairly sophisticated and so forth. Obviously, there's a very different circumstance. I think the parallel in terms of the dynamics of what's happening in North Korea leading to the same kind of unification is probably not there. But the other thing is that the costs of the unification of the Korean Peninsula are actually going to be larger as a share of GDP, of the South Korean GDP, because the gap in incomes is actually even wider between North Korea. I mean, people don't realize this, but North Korea's income per capita is the equivalent of a poor African country. Because people see Pyongyang and they say, well, Pyongyang, you know, this, yeah, it's not, you know, it's not like Seoul, but it's at least, you know, broadly comparable. But I'm telling you, the country is not broadly comparable. I mean, it's got an income per capita of, you know, $400 or $500 a year. And you know, you've got a population that's basically malnourished. And so, you know, you think of that huge gap. Imagine a country like Mexico, except the gap is their GDP per capita is not $8,000 or $9,000, like in Mexico it's $500. Well, the incentives to move are even higher, and the costs of unification are even higher. So, this goes back to an earlier question. The term reunification is often used loosely to mean a German solution. But I think that what unification really means for a lot of South Koreans is just atonement, you know, some process of moving towards accommodation, but actually opening the DMZ to free movement of people and goods and so forth. I don't see this happening anytime soon. I really don't. I mean, that's a long way out. Yeah.
Like for that, I guess, like I know that a lot of people have hopes for North Korea to become like China.
Right.
Do you think, what are the steps that like should be taken, or do you think that it's going to happen anytime soon for that too?
Well, I think Jong-sung said something which I actually agree with very strongly, which is that you know, the prospects for North Korea becoming a democratic country like Germany did, I just think are extremely distant. And so, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to speak up about human rights in North Korea. It's very important that we put that on the table. That's part of our foreign policy. As citizens, it's important to raise those issues. But I think at this juncture, one of the most positive things we could do is to get the North Koreans to think seriously about economic reform. And I can tell you now, I couldn't tell you 3 weeks ago, we had a delegation of 12 North Koreans here about 3 weeks ago, and we had a chance to spend some time with them. And the purpose of that visit was largely to try to get the North Korean economic officials to think about more seriously about the whole issue of transforming their own economy. Because we shouldn't be giving humanitarian aid forever. And even in the context of giving food aid now, I think it's important to have a discussion with the North Koreans and asking them, why are you back here taking food aid after 10 years? I mean, South Korea doesn't have an advantage in producing food, but it exports what it needs and imports the food it needs. And there's no reason why there has to be hunger in North Korea. None. Right? This is a problem which is completely soluble. So I think this is your question is exactly right. And we actually had there's no press here, I guess it is. But we had the opportunity to provide some input to the elders' visit. And one of the things we said that's very important, the message that Carter and the elders deliver is that a signal from the North that they are thinking along the lines that you've described is extremely important, because people are watching what the North Koreans are doing. And if they're moving in an anti-reform direction, then it's signaling that they're not ready to engage with the rest of the world. And I think that that's a leading edge into accomplishing other objectives. Yeah.
It seemed like in the early 2000s they were sort of moving towards certain economic reforms. Is there any understanding of why that sort of slowed down? Was that related to the security issue?
Well, I'll give you a partisan answer, okay, so take it with a grain of salt. I think the Bush administration just missed this. I mean, this happened in the summer of 2002. It was a weirdly designed reform. If you want to read more about it than you ever want to read, you can look at the first book we did called Famine in North Korea, because it has a section on the reform. But I think what happened is that the U.S. was very fixated on the intelligence it was getting about the enriched uranium program. And it was post 9/11. You can excuse the Bush administration to some extent. It's very focused on security issues. But we've gone back, and this will be posted, this is a publication that's in train. We've gone back and looked at that period. And it's very clear that the North Koreans were surprised that the United States wasn't paying attention to the reforms that they did in 2002. So 2002 is really kind of a tragedy. I mean, I think we missed an opportunity to have some kind of rapprochement at that time. And then once we started pointing the fingers at them about uranium, they enriched plutonium and then went down the nuclear path. And the whole thing just went off in a bad direction. So I think we missed an opportunity. Just one quick follow-up.
Yeah, but at the same time, it seems like there was a uranium program.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not denying that there was. I mean, they had, you know, they had maintained some kind of option, you know, of some centrifuges in a box, or maybe some experimental stuff and so forth. But the question is how you approach them about it, and whether you say, look, this is a violation, we've got to do something about this, or whether you say, you know, we're going to come down on, you know, the ton of bricks. I mean, the latter strategy just didn't work. It had the exact opposite. This is where the Jong-sungs of the world were right. I mean, we came down on them very hard, and they ended up testing a nuclear weapon 5 years later. I mean, obviously the strategy didn't achieve its objective, right? Here and then back, yeah.
Oh, I had a question, something after you mentioned about the North Koreans actually themselves ending the oppression or the political persecution. Because what we've seen through videos and LiNK and stuff is that North Korean people are brainwashed and they don't know a lot about like the outside world or anything. And so how would the North Korean people go about actually, like themselves, doing something about reunifying like North and South Korea or overthrowing the regime? Because what I've seen is that they're helpless almost. Like the way they're depicted is pretty bad. And so I was wondering what your thoughts on are them actually realizing what they have to do.
Well, look, the second book, the Witness to Transformation book, is based on refugee interviews. And refugee interviews just create a tremendous number of problems because the people who are leaving obviously have very hostile views of the regime, right? But they do provide some information. And one of the things I just urge people very strongly is when you see pictures of Pyongyang and people who are, you know, dear leader, remember this is Pyongyang. Right? I mean, Pyongyang is a city that's dominated for a large part by people who are part of the elite or attached to the regime much more closely than those who live elsewhere. And, you know, there's pretty strong evidence in the book from the surveys that more information is leaking across that border. And so we have to think of a model of how people behave in such a system. If you lived in such a system and I lived in such a system, what would we do? We would say, you know, dear leader is great, right? But that isn't necessarily what we're thinking. So what authoritarian regimes create is a kind of divided consciousness, right? And Jong-sung knows because he lived this. You know, you behave a certain way when you have to, but you can be thinking very different things. And I don't think we know much what North Koreans think. We have very limited information. But we know, for example, that more North Koreans are seeing South Korean soap operas. Now, you know, you think that's a silly thing, but imagine watching a South Korean soap opera where a family in Seoul is sitting down to dinner and the table is covered with food. I mean, something small like that can have a profound effect. What are these people all driving cars? They have their own cars, you know, and so forth. So, you know, North Koreans are not stupid, and they're not completely cut off from information. More is leaking across. Now, does that mean that that leads them to revolt? The answer is no. What it does is it leads them to live these dual lives where they're trying to make money in the market and they're doing other things and they're talking to people, but they're not necessarily engaged in political activity. And so that's why this doesn't necessarily move in the East German direction, because there isn't the opportunity for the organization to do that. But what we do think is that by that information increasing, and I actually agree with Jones, I don't think the balloons are very effective. But, you know, broadcasting information into North Korea that is picked up increases that gap between the propaganda machinery and reality. And I think ultimately forces the regime to accommodate, to some extent, what people know. You know, you can't say black is white.